The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform one final time before stepping out of her quarters. The crisp fabric felt different against her skin now, not because of any change in the material, but because of what lay beneath it. Hidden under the perfectly pressed sleeves and collar were scars that told a story most people would never fully understand. Sarah had been a Marine for 8 years, serving 3 tours overseas before the incident that changed everything. She had always been proud of her service, proud of the uniform she wore, and proud to stand alongside her fellow Marines. But today felt different. Today was her first day back on active duty after 6 months of recovery, and she wasn't sure how her colleagues would receive her. The explosion had happened on a Tuesday morning in Afghanistan. Sarah's unit had been conducting a routine patrol in a village outside Kabul when an improvised explosive device detonated just 20 feet from where she stood. The blast had thrown her against a concrete wall with such force that it left her unconscious for 3 days. When she finally woke up in the military hospital, the doctors explained that while she was lucky to be alive, the injuries to her face and arms would leave permanent marks. The burns had covered nearly 40% of her upper body, creating a patchwork of discolored skin that would never fully heal. The left side of her face bore the most visible damage, with raised scar tissue that pulled at the corner of her mouth and eye. Her arms, once smooth and strong, now carried twisted patterns of healed flesh that told the story of fire and pain. During her recovery, Sarah had undergone countless surgeries and skin grafts. Each procedure brought its own challenges, its own pain, and its own small victories. The physical therapy had been grueling, but she had pushed through it with the same determination that had carried her through Marine training. What worried her more than the physical challenges were the whispers she had heard from other personnel during her brief visits to the base. Some people stared when they thought she wasn't looking. Others quickly averted their eyes when she caught them glancing at her scars. A few had made comments that they probably thought were supportive, but came across as awkward or patronizing. The worst part was the silence that seemed to follow her wherever she went, as if people were afraid to speak normally around her. As Sarah walked toward the main administrative building, she noticed a group of younger Marines gathered near the entrance. They were fresh-faced recruits, probably no more than 19 or 20 years old, still full of the bravado that came with completing boot camp. She had been like them once, eager to prove herself, and quick to judge others based on appearances. The conversation among the group died as she approached. She could feel their eyes on her scars, could sense their discomfort, even though they tried to hide it. One of them, a tall blonde with perfectly straight teeth, whispered something to his companion that made the other boy snicker. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept walking with her head held high. "Did you see that?" she heard one of them say behind her, his voice carrying farther than he probably intended. "What happened to her face?" Another voice, slightly older but equally thoughtless, responded with a crude joke about Halloween masks. The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow, but Sarah forced herself to keep moving. She had known this would happen. The doctors had warned her that readjusting to military life would involve challenges beyond the physical ones. Inside the building, Sarah reported to Colonel Williams' office for her official return to duty briefing. The colonel, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes, greeted her with genuine warmth. He had visited her several times during her recovery and had been instrumental in ensuring she received the best possible medical care. "Martinez," he said, standing to shake her hand, "it's good to have you back. How are you feeling?" "Ready to serve, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the lingering sting from the encounter outside. Colonel Williams studied her face for a moment, and she could see that he noticed something in her expression. "Walk with me," he said, closing the office door behind them. "I want to show you something." They walked down a long corridor lined with photographs of distinguished service members. Each picture told a story of courage, sacrifice, and honor. Some faces were young and unmarked by war, while others bore the subtle signs of years spent in service to their country. "You see these men and women?" Colonel Williams asked, gesturing to the photographs. Every single one of them has scars. Some you can see, others you can't. But they all carry the marks of their service, and they wear them with pride because they represent something bigger than themselves. Sarah nodded, understanding the message, but still feeling the weight of the stares and whispers that had followed her. There's going to be a ceremony next week, the colonel continued. General Patricia Hayes is coming to inspect the base and address the troops. She specifically asked to meet with you. General Hayes was a legend in the Marine Corps. She had served with distinction for over 30 years, rising through the ranks at a time when few women held positions of authority in the military. Her reputation for toughness was matched only by her reputation for fairness and her unwavering support for her troops. "Why me, sir?" Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Because she knows what it's like to serve when people question whether you belong," Colonel Williams replied. "And because she believes that Marines like you represent the very best of what this Corps stands for." Over the following days, Sarah threw herself into her duties with renewed focus. She was assigned to train the new recruits, the same group she had encountered on her first day. The irony wasn't lost on her that she would be responsible for molding the same young Marines who had mocked her appearance. The training sessions were intense. Sarah pushed the recruits hard, demanding excellence in everything from physical fitness to weapons handling. She could see the confusion in their eyes as they struggled to reconcile their initial impressions of her with the competent, demanding instructor she proved to be. During combat drills, Sarah demonstrated techniques with a precision that left little room for doubt about her capabilities. Her movements were fluid and confident, betraying no hint of the physical limitations her scars might suggest. When she fired her weapon at the range, her shots grouped tightly around the center of the target. When she led them through obstacle courses, she outpaced Marines half her age. Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. The whispers became less frequent, the stares less obvious. Some of the recruits even began to show genuine respect for her expertise. But there were still holdouts, still those who seemed to view her as damaged goods rather than a decorated Marine. The blonde recruit who had made the initial comment proved to be the most challenging. Private Johnson was talented, but arrogant, convinced that his natural abilities made him superior to his peers. He followed Sarah's instructions, but did so with barely concealed resentment, as if taking orders from her was somehow beneath him. During a particularly grueling training exercise, Johnson made a critical error in judgment that could have resulted in serious injury to his fellow recruits. Sarah immediately called a halt to the exercise and addressed him in front of the entire group. "Private Johnson," she said, her voice carrying across the training field, "your recklessness just endangered every Marine on this field. In a combat situation, that kind of mistake gets people killed." Johnson's face reddened with embarrassment and anger. "Yes, ma'am," he replied through gritted teeth, but Sarah could see the defiance in his eyes. After dismissing the other recruits, Sarah asked Johnson to remain behind. She studied him for a long moment, recognizing something of her younger self in his attitude. "You have a problem with me, Private," she said. It wasn't a question. Johnson shifted uncomfortably, but didn't deny it. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" "Granted. I just think that someone who's been compromised shouldn't be responsible for training Marines who might see real combat." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah felt the familiar burn of anger, but she also recognized an opportunity. "Compromised," she repeated slowly. "You think my scars make me less capable of being a Marine?" "I think they make you a liability," Johnson said, his courage growing with his conviction. "How can someone who couldn't protect themselves teach others how to stay safe?" Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his point. "Tell me, Private, what do you think happened to give me these scars?" Johnson shrugged. "Accident, probably. Wrong place, wrong time. I was leading a patrol to deliver medical supplies to a village clinic," Sarah said quietly. "We knew there were insurgents in the area, but those supplies were desperately needed. Children were dying from preventable diseases, and we were their only hope." She began walking toward the barracks, motioning for Johnson to follow. The explosion that gave me these scars also killed 2 insurgents who were planning to attack that clinic. My injuries came from throwing myself between that blast and my fellow Marines. 3 of them went home to their families because of what I did that day." Johnson's cocky expression began to falter as the reality of her words sank in. "These scars aren't a sign of failure, Private," Sarah continued. "They're evidence of a split-second decision to put others before myself. Every morning when I look in the mirror, I'm reminded of the weight of responsibility that comes with wearing this uniform." They walked in silence for several minutes before Sarah spoke again. "You want to know if I'm compromised? Ask yourself this. If you were trapped under enemy fire, would you rather have someone next to you who's never been tested, or someone who's already proven they'll bleed for their brothers and sisters in arms?" The question lingered between them as they reached the barracks. Johnson seemed to struggle with something internal before finally speaking. "Mum, I apologize for my comments. They were out of line." Sarah studied his face, looking for sincerity behind the words. "Apologies are easy, Private. What matters is whether you've learned something from this conversation." "Yes, ma'am, I have." "Good. Because next week, when General Hayes arrives, you're going to see what real leadership looks like. And maybe you'll understand that the most dangerous thing in combat isn't the enemy you can see, but the prejudices you carry with you." As Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she reflected on the conversation with Johnson. She knew that changing minds and hearts was a gradual process, one conversation at a time. But she also knew that the real test would come during General Hayes' visit, when all eyes would be on her and her ability to represent the Marines with honor and dignity. The base was already buzzing with preparation for the general's arrival. Equipment was being polished, uniforms pressed, and procedures reviewed. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and nervousness that came before any important evaluation, but this time it felt different. This time, she wasn't just representing herself. She was representing every Marine who had ever been judged by their scars rather than their service. That night, as she prepared for sleep, Sarah looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her sink. The face that looked back at her bore the unmistakable marks of her experience in Afghanistan. But she no longer saw them as flaws to be hidden. Instead, she saw them as proof of her commitment, evidence of her willingness to sacrifice for something greater than herself. The scars would always be there, a permanent reminder of that Tuesday morning when everything changed. But they were also a reminder of her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering dedication to the Corps and the Marines she served alongside. As she turned off the light and settled into her narrow military cot, Sarah Martinez prepared herself for the challenges that would come with General Hayes' visit, knowing that she had already faced far greater trials and emerged stronger for the experience. The morning of General Hayes' arrival dawned clear and bright, with a crispness in the air that seemed to amplify every sound on the base. Sarah had been awake since 4:30, running through her presentation one final time and ensuring every detail of her appearance met the exacting standards expected during a general's inspection. As she made her way to the parade ground, she could feel the nervous energy that permeated the entire base. Hundreds of Marines moved with purposeful efficiency, their uniforms immaculate, their bearing reflecting the pride and discipline that defined the Corps. Today wasn't just about inspection. It was about demonstrating to one of the military's most respected leaders that this base represented the finest traditions of Marine excellence. The other instructors had gathered near the reviewing stand, their faces reflecting varying degrees of anticipation and concern. Sarah took her place among them, noting that several of her colleagues offered encouraging nods or brief words of support. Over the past week, word had spread about her scheduled meeting with the general, and the response from her fellow Marines had been overwhelmingly positive. Colonel Williams approached the group, his expression serious but reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "General Hayes' convoy is approximately 10 minutes out. I want everyone to remember that we're not just representing ourselves today, but the entire Marine Corps. Conduct yourselves accordingly. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The months of recovery, the painful rehabilitation, the gradual return to active duty, all of it had led to this opportunity to stand before one of the most influential figures in the military and represent something larger than herself. The distant sound of helicopter rotors announced the general's arrival. A sleek military transport touched down on the designated landing zone, and within moments, General Patricia Hayes emerged, followed by her small entourage of staff officers. Even from a distance, her presence was commanding. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority, yet there was an accessibility about her that immediately put those around her at ease. General Hayes was in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a regulation bun and sharp green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her uniform bore the ribbons and decorations earned through 3 decades of distinguished service, but it was her bearing rather than her rank insignia that truly commanded respect. The formal inspection proceeded with military precision. General Hayes moved systematically through the ranks of assembled Marines, pausing occasionally to speak with individual service members or to examine equipment and facilities. Her questions were pointed but fair, demonstrating both her extensive knowledge of military operations and her genuine interest in the welfare of the troops under her command. Sarah watched from her position with the other instructors as the general made her way through the various units. When she spoke with the younger Marines, her manner was encouraging but direct, offering praise where it was earned and constructive criticism where it was needed. It was clear that she possessed the rare combination of toughness and compassion that made for truly effective military leadership. When the formal inspection concluded, Colonel Williams approached General Hayes and spoke briefly with her before gesturing toward the instructor group. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized the moment she had been preparing for was finally at hand. "Sergeant Martinez," Colonel Williams called out, "please join us." Sarah stepped forward, her movements crisp and professional despite the nervous energy coursing through her system. As she approached, she could see General Hayes studying her with the same intense focus she had directed toward every other aspect of the inspection. "Sergeant Martinez," General Hayes said, extending her hand in greeting, "Colonel Williams has told me a great deal about you. It's an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine, ma'am," Sarah replied, accepting the handshake with a firm grip. General Hayes' eyes briefly took in the visible scars on Sarah's face and arms, but her expression remained neutral and professional. "I understand you've recently returned to active duty after recovering from injuries sustained in Afghanistan." "Yes, ma'am. I've been back for 2 weeks and am currently serving as a combat instructor for new recruits." "Excellent. I'd like to observe one of your training sessions, if that would be possible." "Of course, ma'am. I have a group scheduled for combat readiness training in 30 minutes. As they walked toward the training area, General Hayes asked thoughtful questions about Sarah's approach to instruction and her observations about the current group of recruits. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly as she talked about her work, drawing on years of experience to explain the challenges and rewards of preparing young Marines for the realities of military service. The training session that followed would later be remembered as one of the most intense and revealing demonstrations many of the observers had ever witnessed. Sarah had designed a complex scenario that required the recruits to work as a team while facing multiple simulated combat challenges. The exercise was demanding both physically and mentally, pushing each Marine to demonstrate not only their individual skills, but their ability to function as part of a cohesive unit. General Hayes positioned herself where she could observe both the recruits' performance and Sarah's instruction methods. What she saw was a master instructor at work, someone who had clearly thought deeply about every aspect of combat training and who possessed the rare ability to push Marines to exceed their own expectations while keeping them safe. During one particularly challenging portion of the exercise, Private Johnson found himself in a simulated ambush situation that required quick thinking and decisive action. Sarah had deliberately placed him in a position where his natural arrogance would be tested, forcing him to rely on his training rather than his assumptions about his own abilities. When Johnson initially moved to respond in a way that would have exposed his team to enemy fire, Sarah immediately called out a correction. Private Johnson, check your position. You're thinking like an individual, not like a Marine. The correction caused Johnson to pause and reassess the situation. As he did, Sarah continued her guidance with a clarity and authority that left no room for doubt. In combat, your ego is the enemy's best weapon. Use your training, trust your team, and make decisions based on the mission, not your personal glory. Johnson adjusted his approach, coordinating with his fellow recruits to execute a textbook response to the simulated attack. When the exercise concluded, Sarah gathered the group for an immediate debrief, highlighting both the successes and areas for improvement that she had observed. General Hayes watched this entire process with growing appreciation for Sarah's instructional abilities. It was clear that the young sergeant possessed not only technical expertise, but the kind of practical wisdom that could only come from actual combat experience. More importantly, she had the rare gift of being able to translate that experience into lessons that others could understand and apply. When the training session ended, General Hayes requested a private moment with Sarah. They walked to a quiet area near the base chapel, where they could speak without interruption. Sergeant Martinez, the general began, I've observed many training instructors over the years, and I can tell you that what I just witnessed was exceptional. Your ability to challenge those recruits while keeping them focused on the fundamentals of teamwork and mission accomplishment was impressive. Thank you, ma'am. I believe that effective training has to be rooted in real-world experience and genuine concern for the Marines we're preparing for combat. General Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Colonel Williams mentioned that you've faced some challenges since returning to duty. Some personnel have had difficulty accepting your changed appearance. Sarah felt a moment of uncertainty about how to respond. Yes, ma'am. There have been some adjustments required on all sides. I want you to know that I understand what you're dealing with, General Hayes said quietly. When I was a young officer, there were many people who questioned whether women belonged in positions of military leadership. I faced comments, stares, and assumptions about my capabilities that had nothing to do with my actual performance. The admission surprised Sarah, who had always viewed General Hayes as someone who had risen above such petty concerns through sheer force of competence and determination. The difference, the general continued, is that your scars represent something that most Marines will never experience. Actual combat against an enemy determined to kill you and your fellow service members. Those marks aren't signs of weakness. They're credentials that speak to your credibility as an instructor and as a Marine. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the general's words, but she also sensed that there was more to this conversation than simple encouragement. Ma'am, may I ask you something? Of course. How do you handle the moments when people's prejudices make you question your own worth? When their reactions make you wonder if maybe they're right? General Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see that she was choosing her words carefully. I've learned that the opinion of people who judge based on appearances says more about their limitations than about your capabilities. The only validation that truly matters comes from the Marines you lead and the mission you accomplish. They began walking back toward the main part of the base, passing groups of Marines who snapped to attention as they recognized the general. Sarah noticed that several of the recruits from her training session were among those they encountered, and she could see a new respect in their eyes as they observed her walking alongside one of the most senior leaders in the Corps. There's something else I want to discuss with you, General Hayes said as they neared the administrative building. I'm recommending you for a special assignment. The Marine Corps is developing a new combat instructor program designed to prepare Marines for the psychological and physical realities of modern warfare. We need instructors who can speak from experience about what it really means to serve in combat. The offer was unexpected and exciting, representing the kind of career opportunity that Sarah had thought might be beyond her reach, given the circumstances of her injuries. The position would involve traveling to different bases, developing curriculum, and training other instructors, General Hayes continued. It would also mean serving as a visible representative of the Marine Corps, demonstrating that we value substance over appearance and experience over assumptions. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension as she considered the implications of such an assignment. It would mean stepping into a role where her scars would be even more visible, where she would face new groups of Marines who might have their own preconceptions about what a Marine instructor should look like. Ma'am, I'm honored by the offer, but I have to ask, are you certain that someone with my appearance is the right choice for a position with such visibility? General Hayes stopped walking and turned to face Sarah directly. Sergeant Martinez, let me be clear about something. The Marine Corps doesn't need pretty faces representing our values. We need authentic voices speaking from genuine experience. Your scars tell a story about courage, sacrifice, and commitment that no unmarked Marine could ever convey. The conviction in the general's voice left no room for doubt about her sincerity, and Sarah felt something shift inside her, a recognition that her injuries might actually be an asset rather than an obstacle in certain situations. I would be honored to accept the assignment, ma'am. Excellent. There will be a formal announcement later today, but I wanted to speak with you privately first. This assignment will come with its own challenges, but I have complete confidence in your ability to exceed expectations. As they resumed walking, Sarah reflected on the transformation that had occurred in her thinking over the past few weeks. The scars that had once felt like barriers to her success were beginning to feel like credentials that validated her authority and experience. The stares and whispers that had initially caused her so much pain were starting to feel less important than the respect of Marines who valued competence over appearance. The rest of General Hayes' visit passed in a blur of meetings, inspections, and formal presentations. But for Sarah, the most important moments had already occurred during their private conversations and the training demonstration that had allowed her to showcase her abilities as an instructor. As evening approached and General Hayes prepared to depart, she made a point of seeking out Sarah one final time. The two Marines stood together on the tarmac as the general's helicopter prepared for departure, the setting sun casting long shadows across the base. Sergeant Martinez, General Hayes said over the sound of the warming engines, I want you to remember something. Every time someone stares at your scars, they're looking at proof that you've been tested in ways most people never will be. Don't let their discomfort diminish your pride in what those marks represent. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for everything. Thank you for reminding me why I'm proud to serve alongside Marines like you. As the helicopter lifted off and disappeared into the gathering darkness, Sarah stood alone on the tarmac, feeling a sense of purpose and direction that had been absent during her recovery. The conversation with General Hayes had fundamentally changed her perspective on her injuries and her future in the Marine Corps. Walking back toward the barracks, she encountered Private Johnson and several other recruits from her training session. For the first time since her return to duty, their expressions showed none of the discomfort or judgment she had grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, she saw something that was far more valuable, respect earned through demonstrated competence and validated by recognition from the highest levels of Marine leadership. Ma'am, Johnson said as she approached, we wanted to thank you for the training session today. It was eye-opening. How so, Private? Well, ma'am, I think we all learned something about what it really means to be a Marine, and about not judging people based on appearances. Sarah smiled, the expression pulling slightly at her scarred skin but feeling more natural than it had in months. The best lessons in life often come from sources we least expect, Private. Remember that as you continue your training. As she walked away from the group of young Marines, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The circle that had begun with her injuries in Afghanistan and continued through her difficult recovery and return to duty was finally closing. But rather than ending, she realized it was actually the beginning of a new chapter, one in which her scars would serve not as reminders of what she had lost, but as symbols of what she had gained through her service and sacrifice. 6 months after General Hayes' visit, Sarah found herself standing in front of a mirror in a hotel room in Quantico, Virginia, preparing for what would be one of the most important presentations of her career. The new combat instructor program had been officially launched, and today she would address a gathering of senior military officials, including generals from multiple branches of the armed forces. The assignment that General Hayes had offered had proven to be everything Sarah had hoped for and more. Over the past months, she had traveled to 8 different military installations, working with instructors and developing curriculum that emphasized the psychological aspects of combat preparation. Her unique perspective, informed by both her combat experience and her personal journey of recovery, had resonated with Marines across the Corps. But today's presentation was different. Today, she would be speaking not just to fellow Marines, but to a joint military audience that included representatives from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard. The pressure was enormous, but so was the opportunity to influence military training practices across all branches of service. As she adjusted her dress uniform one final time, Sarah reflected on the changes that had occurred in her life since that difficult first day back on active duty. The stares and whispers hadn't completely disappeared, but they had been overshadowed by a growing recognition of her expertise and contributions. More importantly, her own relationship with her scars had fundamentally changed. Where once she had seen disfigurement, she now saw evidence of her commitment to her fellow Marines. Where once she had felt shame, she now felt pride in the sacrifices she had made in service to her country. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been complete and lasting. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Opening it, she found Colonel Williams standing in the hallway, dressed in his own formal uniform and carrying a folder of documents. "Ready for this, Martinez?" he asked with a smile that mixed confidence with just a hint of nervousness. "As ready as I'll ever be, sir. Are you here to wish me luck or to make sure I don't embarrass the Corps?" "Both," he replied with a chuckle. "But mostly I'm here because General Hayes asked me to give you this." He handed her an envelope bearing the official seal of the Marine Corps. Inside, Sarah found a brief handwritten note from the general. "Sergeant Martinez, today you speak not just for yourself, but for every Marine who has ever been underestimated because of how they look rather than what they've accomplished. Make them listen. Make them understand. Semper Fi. P. Hayes." The note provided the final boost of confidence Sarah needed. As she and Colonel Williams made their way to the conference center, she felt the familiar pre-presentation butterflies, but they were accompanied by a deep sense of purpose that gave her strength. The presentation hall was larger than she had expected, filled with approximately 200 military personnel, representing every level of command from lieutenant to general. As Sarah took her place at the podium, she could see the mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and genuine interest on the faces looking back at her. General Hayes was seated in the front row, her presence serving as both an inspiration and a reminder of the trust that had been placed in Sarah's shoulders. Also in the audience were several of the recruits she had trained over the past months, including Private Johnson, who had specifically requested permission to attend after learning about the presentation. "Good morning," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the large room. "My name is Sergeant Sarah Martinez, and I'm here today to talk about something that affects every military instructor and every service member we train, the difference between what we see and what we understand." She paused, allowing her gaze to sweep across the audience, noting the immediate attention her words had captured. "When you look at me, the first thing you probably notice are these scars. They're hard to miss, and I'm not going to pretend they don't affect how people initially react to me. But I want to tell you what these scars really represent and why that matters for military training." Sarah went on to describe the incident in Afghanistan, not dwelling on the graphic details of her injuries, but focusing instead on the split-second decisions that had led to her current appearance. She talked about the choice to put herself between danger and her fellow Marines, and about the months of recovery that had forced her to examine her own assumptions about strength, capability, and what it truly meant to serve. The morning I returned to active duty, she continued, I encountered a group of young Marines who made jokes about my appearance. They saw damaged goods. They saw someone who had been broken by war. What they didn't see was someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for the experience. She noticed that several audience members were leaning forward, clearly engaged by her personal story, but also curious about how it connected to broader military training principles. This experience taught me something crucial about how we prepare our service members for combat. We spend enormous amounts of time and resources training their bodies and their tactical skills, but we often neglect to prepare them for the psychological reality of war. Not just the stress of combat, but the challenge of serving alongside people who may look different than expected. Sarah clicked to her first presentation slide, which showed statistics about military injuries and recovery rates. Every year, thousands of our service members are wounded in the line of duty. Many of them return to active service, carrying visible reminders of their sacrifice. How we treat these returning veterans says everything about our values as a military organization. The next portion of her presentation focused on the specific training modifications she had developed based on her experiences. She described scenarios designed to challenge preconceptions about ability and appearance, exercises that force service members to work with people they might initially underestimate, and discussions that addressed the psychological aspects of serving alongside wounded veterans. One of the most effective exercises we've implemented, Sarah explained, involves pairing new recruits with veterans who carry visible signs of their service. Not just scars, but prosthetics, mobility aids, or other adaptations. The recruits' initial reactions are often telling, but more importantly, they learn quickly that appearance has no correlation with competence or dedication. She shared specific examples from her travels to different bases, describing how Marines who had initially been uncomfortable around wounded veterans had become some of their strongest advocates after working with them in training scenarios. The key, she explained, was creating opportunities for meaningful interaction rather than avoiding potentially awkward situations. The goal isn't to make people ignore differences, Sarah emphasized. It's to help them see past surface appearances to recognize the person and the capabilities underneath. In combat, that ability to quickly assess true capability rather than assumed limitation can mean the difference between life and death. As her presentation continued, Sarah noticed that the initial skepticism she had sensed from some audience members was giving way to genuine engagement with her ideas. Questions were being asked not about her qualifications or appearance, but about the practical implementation of her training methods. One Army colonel raised his hand and asked, Sergeant Martinez, have you seen measurable improvements in unit cohesion and performance when these training methods are implemented? Yes, sir. We've documented significant improvements in several key areas. Units that undergo this expanded training show better integration of diverse personnel, reduced incidents of discrimination or harassment, and improved overall morale. More importantly, they demonstrate better tactical performance because they're making decisions based on actual capabilities rather than assumptions. A Navy captain followed up with a question about adapting the program for different service branches, leading to a detailed discussion about the universal nature of the challenges Sarah had identified. It became clear that her insights had applications far beyond the Marine Corps. As the formal presentation concluded and the question and answer session began, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Not only had she successfully communicated her ideas to a senior military audience, but she could see that many of them were genuinely interested in implementing similar programs within their own commands. After the official session ended, Sarah was approached by dozens of officers who wanted to discuss specific aspects of her presentation or share their own experiences with similar challenges. One particular conversation stood out. A Navy captain who had lost his left arm in an IED explosion and had struggled with many of the same issues Sarah had faced. Sergeant, he said, I want to thank you for putting into words something I've been struggling to articulate for years. The assumption that wounded veterans are somehow less capable is not just wrong, it's dangerous. What you're doing here could change how we think about military service in fundamental ways. The validation from a fellow wounded veteran meant more to Sarah than all the official recognition she had received. It confirmed that her experiences weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern that needed to be addressed systematically across the military. Later that evening, at the official reception following the presentation, Sarah found herself in conversation with General Hayes and several other senior officers. The discussion centered on plans for expanding the training program and implementing it across multiple military installations. Sergeant Martinez, General Hayes said during a brief pause in the conversation, "I have to ask you something. When I first met you 6 months ago, did you imagine that your experiences would lead to this kind of influence on military training policy?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "No, ma'am. When I was lying in that hospital bed, wondering if I would ever feel like a Marine again, I never imagined that my injuries could become a source of strength rather than weakness. But I think that's part of the lesson we're trying to teach, that we often can't see our own potential until we're forced to confront our assumptions about ourselves." "That's a wise observation," the general replied, "and it speaks to something larger about military service. We ask our people to face situations that will change them in ways they can't predict. Our job is to ensure that those changes make them stronger, not just individually, but as part of the larger military community." As the evening wound down, Sarah stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the Potomac River. The lights of Washington, D.C. twinkled in the distance, and she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scared, uncertain Marine who had returned to duty 6 months ago seemed like a different person now. Private Johnson appeared at her side, having been granted permission to attend the reception as recognition for his own growth over the past months. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I wanted to apologize again for my behavior when you first returned, and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what, Private?" "For not giving up on me. For showing me that being a Marine is about more than just physical strength or perfect appearance. You taught me that character is measured by how we respond to adversity, not by how we avoid it." Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar tug of her scarred skin, but no longer self-conscious about it. "Private Johnson, the best thing about the Marine Corps is that we all have the opportunity to become better versions of ourselves. You've done that, and I'm proud to have played a small part in your development." As Johnson returned to the reception, Sarah remained on the balcony for a few more minutes, enjoying the quiet after an intense day. She thought about the Marines she would train in the coming months, about the officers who would implement new programs based on her experiences, and about the wounded veterans who would benefit from a military culture that valued substance over appearance. The scars on her face and arms would always be with her, permanent reminders of a day in Afghanistan when everything changed. But they had become something more than markers of injury or trauma. They had become symbols of resilience, credentials that spoke to her credibility as an instructor, and bridges that connected her to other service members who had faced their own challenges and emerged stronger. When Sarah finally returned to her hotel room that night, she found another message waiting for her. This one from the Department of Defense, formally requesting her assistance in developing a comprehensive training program that would be implemented across all branches of the military. The recognition represented the culmination of months of hard work, but more importantly, it validated the idea that her experiences could have lasting positive impact on military culture. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah looked once more in the mirror, seeing not the damaged Marine who had returned to duty 6 months earlier, but a confident instructor whose experiences had given her unique insights into the nature of service and sacrifice. The reflection looking back at her bore the marks of war, but it also radiated a sense of purpose and accomplishment that no amount of physical perfection could have provided. The journey from victim to victor, from wounded veteran to respected instructor, was complete. But Sarah knew that her real work was just beginning. There were thousands of service members who needed to understand that true strength came not from avoiding adversity, but from facing it with courage and emerging with their values and commitment intact. The Marines who had once jeered at her wounds were now among her strongest supporters, having learned that appearances could deceive and that real capability was measured by performance, not perfection. The general who had recognized her potential despite her scars had helped her find a path that transformed personal trauma into professional opportunity. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered that her scars, rather than being barriers to success, had become the foundation for a new kind of leadership, one based on authentic experience, hard-earned wisdom, and an unshakable understanding of what it truly meant to serve with honor and distinction. The Marine Corps had given her the opportunity to rebuild her life after devastating injuries. In return, she had given the Corps new insights into how to build stronger, more resilient Marines who valued character over appearance and substance over superficiality. It was an exchange that would continue to pay dividends for years to come, ensuring that future generations of service members would benefit from the lessons learned through one Marine's journey from trauma to triumph.